Now for today's program. Ivo H. Daalder is president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Prior to joining the council, he served as the U.S. ambassador to NATO for more than 4 years. He also served on the U.S. National Security Council staff as director for European affairs. Before his appointment as ambassador to NATO, Dr. Daalder was senior fellow in foreign policy studies at the Brookings Institution, specializing in American foreign policy, European security and transatlantic relations, and national security affairs. A widely published author, his books include The Empty Throne, America's Abdication of Global Leadership, and Crescent of Crisis, U.S.-European Strategy for the Greater Middle East, among many others. Ambassador Daalder is a frequent contributor to the opinion pages of the world's leading newspapers and a regular commentator on international affairs on television and radio. For his service at NATO, Ambassador Daalder received many awards, including the U.S. Secretary of Defense Medal for Outstanding Public Service and the Order of Merit by the Federal Republic of Germany. Robert Siegel was the senior host of NPR's award-winning news magazine All Things Considered for 30 years. In 2018, he was awarded the Edward Murrow Lifetime Achievement Award in Journalism. He has been honored with 3 silver batons from Alfred I. DuPont Columbia University, as well as the American Bar Association's Silver Gavel Award. Currently, he hosts Navigating the New Abnormal, a series of web seminars sponsored by American Friends of Rabin Medical Center on the JBS, Jewish Broadcasting Service Television Network. Robert is a special literary contributor to Moment Magazine and serves on the advisory board for Moment's Daniel Pearl Investigative Journalism Initiative. Please welcome Ambassador Ivo H. Daalder and Robert Siegel.
Suzanne, thank you. And Ivo, thank you very much for being with us on this very grim day, as it turned out. And I'd like you to begin, if you will, to, as we would say in the newsroom, write the lead. Tell us what of significance has happened today. Why is it of such significance? And how did it happen?
Well, thanks, Robert. Really good to see you, even on a grim day like that, and Suzanne for your introduction. This is momentous. I think this is a turning point in European security and global security that we will look back at as one of those dates that sort of defines history in the same way that December 7 or now February 24 or September 11 do. This is a major development, something different, something we haven't seen. A big country that for 4 months prepared an invasion of a neighboring country that posed no threat, was not provoked, didn't do anything to deserve anything like what we're seeing happening today. And I think we must be clear. What Vladimir Putin started last night, something that U.S. intelligence had gotten wind of as far back as October, is a full-scale invasion of a neighboring country. We haven't seen anything like this in Europe, at least, for a very long time, like I would say 1945. And that is where we are. Why? And why is this happening? Where does it come from? And what is the significance of this? This has to do with Vladimir Putin, fundamentally and completely. Remember where Putin was on that other day, November 11th, 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down. He was a KGB colonel in a far away place in Dresden, hardly the center of where the KGB would send its most capable agents. And he saw really the end of the Soviet Empire and presented it from the day one, and believed that Soviet leaders had betrayed the Soviet Union and its people. He worked his way up through being a mayor in St. Petersburg, and then part of the security apparatus, became prime minister of Russia under Boris Yeltsin, and then the acting president. And really from that moment on, he did 2 things: strengthen the Russian state and the capacity for it to find a time in which, secondly, he could revisit the end of the Cold War. The Cold War that ended in our narrative, with the liberation of Eastern and Central Europe, indeed the liberation of the Soviet Union and the peoples of the Soviet Union, who have been under the yoke of Soviet power, military power, political power, horrendous repression, economic power. And all of a sudden, when the wall came down, the prospect for German unification, for European unification, and for freedom of people who had hunkered for freedom for a long time became possible. For him, it was the end of Soviet dominion, the end of Russian empire, and now he's trying to reestablish it. That's really fundamentally what this is all about.
I want to go back to the collapse of the Russian Empire, and we can perhaps call up a map of Europe to lend a visual dimension to this. Because the question that I have for you, really, Ivo, is I want you to explain why Ukraine. That is, if we look at Russia bordering it up in the north, south of Finland, are the three Baltic republics, which are independent, and they're members of NATO now. There's Belarus, which is extremely close to Russia, and then there's Ukraine. What is so significant about Ukraine in Russian eyes that we've seen this invasion and the months that preceded it?
So there are two things that are significant about Ukraine. One is there is a close relationship between Ukraine and Russia. In many parts of history, these were one country, not two. Although there have been also times in history in which Ukraine was independent, like it is today, and it has been for the last 30 years. But there's a historical affinity, there's a religious affinity, there's a historical affinity that exists between Ukraine, Belarus as well, and Russia. What distinguishes Belarus and Ukraine is that, frankly, since 1994, and certainly since 2020, Belarus has been completely and totally subservient to Moscow. It dances to Putin's tune. Alexander Lukashenko, who stole an election in 2020 and really brutally repressed civilians who were protesting the stealing of the election, turned to Russia, and Russia gave him the support he needed directly and indirectly to survive, but at the cost of him becoming completely subservient to Russia. That's what Russia wants from Ukraine, a completely subservient state, both because of the imperial ambitions of Russia, but secondly, and more importantly, because of what Ukraine represents to Russia. Ukraine had two revolutions, one in 2004-05 and another one in 2014, in which the people of Ukraine said, we don't want to be governed by people who have the interest of Russia in mind. We want to be governed by the people who have the interest of Ukraine in mind. And the Orange Revolution, the second colored revolution, the first one was the Rose Revolution in Georgia, and then later the Maidan Revolution, the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, were expressions of democratic will by the people of Ukraine, who sought to determine their own destiny. And oh, by the way, in the 2014 case, the will to join the West, not NATO, but the European Union, and it is the threat of democracy succeeding on Russia's border that fundamentally Putin sees as a threat, because if it can succeed in Ukraine, why can't it succeed in Russia? And then what is Vladimir Putin's role in a country like this?
The Maidan, we should say, is I guess it's in the center of the city, the capital of Ukraine, which in Russian would be called Kiev. And maybe some of our viewers remember grandparents speaking of having been in Kiev at some point. In Ukrainian, it's Kiev, and that just to explain why the pronunciation changed at some point. I want to ask you a question about each of four parties to this conflict in different ways: the Ukrainians, the Russians, the Europeans, and the United States. And starting with Russia, the invasion that Vladimir Putin has undertaken obviously includes some likely loss of life, and it includes economic sanctions imposed by the United States and Europe. Are those costs, do you think, seen as minor and manageable by Putin, or is taking control of Ukraine so important that it's worth feeling real pain to achieve it? Or has Putin improvised and perhaps miscalculated the consequences of his actions?
So I think he's miscalculated, and we will find out how much he has miscalculated. I think he took the actions believing that he could get away with it. That he believed, he looked at the West, and we'll talk later about the U.S. and the problems there and in Europe, but he looked at the West, thought it was too divided, too weak, not led by a strong United States, which was too internally divided. A Biden who had over Afghanistan and other issues stumbled, and that he could take advantage of the moment, and that he could sort of force his way in. I think he has been surprised by the united reaction that the U.S. has been able to forge together with its allies, which meant that he had to move militarily. I think he would have preferred to do it through bluff and intimidation. He now has to move militarily. And I think this is when the second time he's going to make a miscalculation. He's calculating that the costs of the military intervention will be less than the benefits that accrue to him. I think he sorely miscalculates in two fundamental ways. One, this is going to be very costly in terms of Russian lives. Yes, it will be even more costly in terms of Ukrainian lives, but the Ukrainians are defending their own territory. And the Russians are trying to occupy it. That is always a mismatch. And yes, Russian military is far more capable than the Ukrainian military, and probably in relatively short order will be able to take control of whatever part, if not all of it, Ukraine it wants to take control. But then what? And let's go back to 2003. We took control of Iraq in a really quick time. We toppled Saddam Hussein. We didn't actually were able to get him, but you remember the pictures of the statues being toppled. And today we're still in Iraq facing still an insurgency because there are people in Iraq who don't want us there. I can guarantee you there are people in Ukraine who don't want the Russians there, and they're willing to fight for it. And that's one cost. And I think those costs are going to be significant, and they may well affect Russian policy. And then, of course, on sanctions. The sanctions that are going to be announced, as we speak, by the President of the United States and by others are going to be very, very, very significant. Yes, Putin has prepared for sanctions. He's got a humongous reserve, $650 billion in reserve currency. But ultimately, when you're effectively cut off from the economy of the world, or at least the European and advanced Asian democracy economies, is going to cost them. And those costs may turn out to be unacceptable to the Russian people. And then we'll see what happens.
Do you think that those costs, though, would be unacceptable over the course of months, or would it be over the course of several years before the pain is really felt?
I think it's going to be the latter. I think we are into a long period of containment, the kind of policies that we pursued during the Cold War, where we are trying to pose costs on Russia from the outside in order over time to affect internal change from the inside. And that change will not come by the US or others invading or directly intervening. No, it comes from the internal dynamics. We know how this works because we've played this movie before. It is the policy that George Kennan wrote about in his famous long telegram in 1947, later published as the X article in Foreign Affairs, and that we pursued in one form or another, and in some ways at times mistakenly, for 40 years, which led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Internally, a collapse of the Soviet Union because the cost of continuing the rule that the Soviet Union had became too big.
You mentioned George F. Kennan. The columnist Tom Friedman cited George F. Kennan the other day. He recalled interviewing him as the Soviet Union had collapsed and as NATO was expanding east. And Kennan cautioned that it would be, not his phrase, but it would be a kind of reckless triumphalism to move NATO farther east, to absorb the former Warsaw bloc countries, that NATO had achieved its point. It had defeated the Soviet Union. what was the need for the alliance after that, which was something that Russian leaders have said since. What other purpose is there to your alliance other than to attack us? Apart from the desire of Putin to recreate the Russian Empire, are they seriously worried about the presence of NATO forces in Warsaw and Hungary and Slovakia?
I don't think so. I think they're, to the extent they're worried, is because there are no Russian forces in Poland and Slovakia, which is their preference. And you know, I think two things on Tom Friedman and George Kennan, both of whom I admire greatly, but on this point, I just fundamentally disagree. This was not NATO expanding east. This was the countries of Central and Eastern Europe demanding to be protected, to for the first time in decades, to enjoy the independence and freedom that the people of Western Europe, and indeed the United States, have been enjoyed since 1945. These were countries under the yoke of Soviet power, who have been denied freedom, denied prosperity, denied the independence that they had long sought. And they believed, rightly in my view, that membership in the Western Club, which was at that time defined by the European Union and NATO, was the best ways to secure them. And just think what would have happened, given what we are seeing today, if the Baltic states were not part of NATO, if Poland was not part of NATO, if Hungary and Slovakia were not part of NATO, all bordering Russia and Belarus and Ukraine. Romania wasn't part of NATO. What would be happening right now?
But to go back to Ukraine, Ukraine isn't part of NATO, and the Ukrainians have over the past 20 years, according to polling, held different views of whether the country should be part of NATO. Explain, and I think there are Ukrainians right now who wish that NATO would come to their aid, and think that the response to what Russia's doing should be more aggressive on the part of the West. Explain why Ukraine is not a member of NATO and why it would be important for Ukraine to be a member of NATO.
Well, I'm not sure the latter is the case, but I mean, the reason why I think is that the Ukrainians themselves have always been divided on this issue. And for a country to join NATO, it's good that the country actually wants to join NATO. This is not something that NATO wants to impose on other countries. Even when countries do want to join NATO, NATO has the right to say no, as in fact it has continued to do with a number of other countries. It was only in 2014, really, after the Russian invasion of Crimea and annexation of Crimea, and then support for the breakaway separatists, direct support, instigated separatism in eastern Donbass, that for the first time Ukrainian popular opinion turned in favor of membership. But even today, it's only 62%. I mean, it's a big majority, but it's only 62% who want to be members of NATO. So it's very important that a country really is dedicated to this. And the Ukrainians have sought to find out. They don't want to have a bad relationship with Russia. They understand that many of them have Russian family. Many have family in Russia. And there is a direct link between the two countries that is strong, that needs to be maintained. They want neighborly relations only when their independence and sovereignty is threatened. All of a sudden, do they say, hey, listen, maybe NATO is the way that we can protect ourselves?
Let me ask you another question about Ukraine. Perhaps we can call up another map of Ukraine, which shows this well. As you've said, Russia has supported, with many people say, with actually, well, no, not the Baltic Republic, the other map that shows Crimea. There we are. In this map, we can see that the Crimean Peninsula is sort of half Russian, half Ukrainian. It was seized by Russia, and in the Far East, we don't see them demarcated in this map, are the regions surrounding the cities of Donetsk and Luhansk, which Vladimir Putin strangely has declared independent. That is, it's usually the country itself declares itself independent, but he joined in that declaration. Do you think that since there's been talk all along of how there should have been talks, that if only we could have pushed diplomacy further, do you think that realistically those eastern districts of eastern provinces of Ukraine that would be near the, I guess, near the Sea of Azov in this drawing, and Crimea would remain part of Russia in an agreement by which Russia withdrew from the rest of Ukraine? Does that strike you as something that the Ukrainians could ever accept?
You mean after what's happened in the last?
Yes, after what's happened today. Yeah.
I don't know how, wars end in various different ways, and wouldn't be the first time in history that a war takes place and then new borders get drawn. But it would not be Ukrainians' choice. Certainly not my choice either. And I think it's important to remember that Ukraine in 1990, all of Ukraine voted on the question of independence from the Soviet Union. And that the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, 84% of the people voted in favor of independence. And that was true even in Crimea. A strong majority voted in favor of independence. Yes, there was a weird referendum in 2014 that the Russians managed. I don't know how you do a referendum in a foreign country, but they were able to do that and claimed that Crimea wanted to become part of Russia. And surely there are people who would, but the overwhelming majority of people who live in these countries, Russian speaking or not, are Ukrainian, and they believe in being Ukrainian. And I think the idea that somehow all Russian people want to be part of Russia, well, tell that to the people in Israel or in parts of New York or in Little Moscow in Miami. These are not people who want to be part of Russia, even if they speak Russian. And this notion of an ethnic idea that people who are like us must live in the same country, and by the way, under the same rule, just isn't realistic in the 21st century. In fact, wasn't realistic in the 19th century either, which is one of the reasons we have these states in which borders don't necessarily interact with ethnic, tribal, religious, national, or other divisions. The Canadian ambassador to the Security Council the other day gave a remarkably insightful speech about how borders drawn in London and Paris and Berlin and Africa cut right across national, tribal, and other divisions, and that there was an agreement in Africa early on that if one country was going to change borders, everybody was going to change borders. So let's just live with it and try to figure out how to move together. That's what Vladimir Putin should have done in this case too.
Ask you a question about Europe and specifically Germany. Germany very significantly moved to stop work on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. I wonder how long you think the Germans are willing to stand by that decision, and which is greater, in effect, Europe's need for Russian gas and oil or Russia's need for European customers?
The pipeline is dead. That pipeline will not have gas flow through it until there's a different regime in Russia. I think that was clear, frankly, even before the events of the last couple of days. In my mind, I thought the pipeline was never going to work, but it's dead for now.
And how important is that to Russia to have lost?
It's important to Russia because, to your second question, European customers are far more important for Russia than Russian gas is to Europe, for two reasons. One, although Europe still depends on Russian gas, particularly Baltic states and others, the overall demand in time can be met by alternative sources. Last month, the LNG imports, liquid natural gas, into Europe were larger than what was flowing through Russian pipelines. That's a major change. Of course, the United States is now an exporter of LNG. So is Qatar, so is Australia, so are other places. A concerted effort is now underway to provide alternative means. And over time, gas is just not going to be as important, natural gas, as we have alternative means of generating electricity and heat. And as a result, you know, the reality is when you are a fossil fuel economy these days, you don't have long, given what's happening on climate change and given Europeans' leading effort to change its reliance on fossil fuels for its economy and
Now,
livelihood.
let me come around to the United States, and I'd like you to address an American right now who may be watching this, who says everything you say is true. I mean, this is bullying behavior. This is perhaps it's a grandiloquent behavior on the part of Putin, who must be head of a superpower. God forbid it only be a regional power. You're right. It's all true, and it's unfair. On the other hand, it's on the other side of the earth, and what does this have to do with us? And why should my cousin in the reserves be wondering when he gets called up to preferably a peaceful line in Poland, or perhaps being sucked into this? Why is it of such great interest to the United States?
So I'd have two, sort of a biographical piece to it and a strategic piece. I mean, on the strategic piece, the 20th century taught us a lesson, which is the United States doesn't have a choice about whether it gets involved in European wars. The only choice it has is to get involved in hot wars or in cold wars. In the first part of the 20th century, the United States in 2017, and then again in 1941, in 1917, I should say, and in 1941, sent thousands, millions of its young men and women to end wars, internecine wars in Europe. It then sent in the 1950s large numbers of men and families to live in Europe in order to prevent the Third World War. And it did very successfully at an extraordinarily less cost in lives, treasure, and anything else than would have been the case if we had to go back. And so now we want to make sure that if there is this war that has occurred on European territory stays where it is and doesn't engulf further, and would, even if we stayed away, engulf and make us have to come back because Russia is trying to reclaim parts of the European system that we can't allow it to have, and therefore we are back in war. Better to be there in large numbers to prevent that from happening. And there's a personal reason for this. We learned a lesson in 1940, 41, 42, which is that we in Europe, and I'm born and raised in the Netherlands, a country occupied by the Germans, family that was lost in the Holocaust, including my mother having to flee to Switzerland in the midst of all of this. We looked to the United States, and Europe has looked to the United States as the final protector of not only our country, but who we are and our democracy, our freedom, our prosperity. And we build a system in the second half of the 20th century that we maintained into the 21st century, in which the presence of the United States in foreign countries isn't about dominating them. It's about protecting them and providing that protection at far less cost than if you have to send planes and ships to fight wars because it is too late. So that's why we need to be there. Freedom of Europe, our freedom, ultimately is at stake. These are not some foreign peoples far away. These are people like us. In this sense, we are all Ukrainian today, just as when we were attacked on 9/11, we were all Americans.
Since you've raised the experience of Europe and the Holocaust and the Second World War, what do you make of Vladimir Putin's proposing that part of what will be accomplished in Ukraine will be its denazification, his use of the word genocide to describe what Ukrainians are supposedly up to. Let me just add here that there's no whataboutism here. We have journalists who've been based all over Ukraine. It's not a Nazi regime, and there's no genocide that's been underway there. But But Vladimir Putin tells that to the Russians. And what do you make of that? He also throws in the fact that the Soviet Union is a great nuclear power, which is also rather menacing.
I mean, this is who he is. I mean, Ukraine is one of the few countries in the world. I think the only country outside of Israel that is run by a Jewish president and a Jewish prime minister, in which a Jewish president lost a large part of his family to the Holocaust.
This is Zelensky.
Zelensky, as he, in fact, recounted his yesterday in a really moving speech. I guess early this morning in our time. No, last night our time, early this morning in Ukrainian time. This idea, it's a very crude way of thinking. In certainly this part of the world, 80 years after the Cold War, this idea that Russia, besieged as it was in World War II, by the way, of course, Russia became involved in World War II by invading Poland and seizing the Baltic states for itself. This myth that it was, betrayed or invaded, it was betrayed by the people who they had signed up to divide Poland and part of the world on. But this idea of the Great Patriotic War, which yesterday I think was the commemoration of defending the motherland's day, I think it was.
That's the name that the Russians used for the Second World War.
That's right, the Great Patriotic War. This idea of the Great Patriotic War, they were fighting against Nazis and against genocide, although less against genocide than they were fighting against Nazis. So it is using the imagery of the Great Patriotic War, of Russia under attack, Russia standing tall, whether it was in the siege of Stalingrad or what have you, and the threat that Ukraine supposedly poses to Russian-speaking people, indeed any people, in terms of genocide. It's propaganda used to whip up public sentiment. It's not going to work, by the way. It just the reality is the internet and everything else that's going on. It may affect an older population. It's certainly not going to work for a younger population that is far too savvy and far too understanding of what's really going on, which is why this war is not going to be seen as popular in Russia in the way that taking Crimea was, which was bloodless, quick, and Crimea had a different history that the argument could be made differently than saying we're defending Russia against the Nazis. That was a long time.
And do the Ukrainians have the resolve and the firepower to inflict pain on Russian troops that it appears inevitably will win a conflict to take over Ukraine? But will it actually be that costly to them, given what the Ukrainians have in the way of defenses?
Well, Ukrainian defenses are far different than they were 8 years ago. They have significantly bolstered their capacity. It's a standing army of 250,000 troops. That's not nothing. They have been trained by NATO countries, by the United States over the preceding eight years. They have been outfitted with much more modern and better equipment. Clearly, the Russian army and Air Force and Navy will overwhelm them, but one will pay a big price doing so. This is not marching in. Remember when people were talking about walking into Iraq in 2003, that it would be a cakewalk. This ain't no cakewalk. So the cost is going to be high. And secondly, you have a very determined Ukrainian population that will resist. And wars don't end just because tanks stop rolling. Wars end when one is subjugated to the other. Again, the Iraq analogy is not a bad one in this one. We will find Ukrainians fighting an insurgency. And indeed, I would hope that the United States and NATO allies would help the Ukrainians in fighting that insurgency.
Well, let me ask you about that point, because I think it's understood right now that actual NATO involvement in the fighting in Ukraine is off the table. The U.S. sending troops into Ukraine to fight Russians has President Biden made it very clear early on that that's not what we're talking about. Would actually supporting an insurgency movement from across the border in Poland, is that on the table? And do we think that that Putin would once again invoke his nuclear his nuclear arsenal if such a thing were to happen?
Yeah, I think it's very much on the table. And I think there's an obligation for us to help the Ukrainians defend themselves. This is an independent country that has been attacked, and if we're not willing to send our own troops, and if we were, that's a little late, and we're not, then the very least we can do is to help the Ukrainians defend themselves. And Putin may well, throw around his nuclear saber, but the reality is, we have nuclear weapons too. We don't have to remind him. I think he knows. And any use of nuclear weapons by the Russians would lead to retaliation by the United States. It's just a risk he can't afford any more than we can, which is why even during the Cold War standoff, we never actually got to a nuclear exchange. And indeed never got to a direct exchange between American and Russian forces because of the fear of escalation. But we shouldn't be self-deterred. We shouldn't, which in fact is what we already did by not sending forces into Ukraine. That doesn't mean we can't help the Ukrainians defend themselves. And it is in our interest to enhance and increase the cost on the Russians for their continued occupation and presence in Ukraine, because we want to change the policy that the Russians are engaged in.
I want to ask you about what you make of Putin's behavior right now. There are people who look at this as what you've called a miscalculation on his part, and question his rationality and question even his how stable he is. There are others who say, look, people have said for many decades that Russia without Ukraine is a country, Russia with Ukraine is an empire. It is something that registers with many Russians, that this is to me the analogy always was, it was like they're Ireland somehow. It was this place that they were very deeply connected to, and by that reasoning, it is actually, it would be a unifying act in Russia to make war in Ukraine. He's won other wars where he's intervened. And it seems to have not weakened his popularity there. Is his behavior, and they would say by that standard, it's rational. Where do you come down on the question of how rational or irrational Vladimir Putin is being?
Yeah, I don't think he's irrational. I think his rationality is different. Perhaps his calculation of that are different than ours, and that we would make. And I think we can say he's miscalculating without saying that he's irrational. I do think, and we know this from recent interlocutors with him, most importantly, the Finnish president who has spent quite a lot of time talking to him, and the recent visit that President Macron of France had, who said on the way back that he was a different person than the last time they met in 2019. And we know two things. We know that he has been extremely isolated because of COVID. The long tables and scenes are just the weird scene of having a champagne toast with the president of Armenia, I guess, the other day, in which they're standing on opposite sides of the room. He has been very afraid of catching COVID, so he's been very isolated. And through those 2 years, he hasn't had a lot of people telling him things he didn't want to hear. And as the former Swedish Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Carl Bildt once said recently, he said he used that time to read really bad Russian history, and may have been really convinced of the arguments that he's laid out first in a paper that he no doubt wrote last July about why Ukraine is not really a country, and then this remarkable speech of Monday, which, by the way, if you read that speech and then still think that this is all about NATO, you've had a problem. This is in that sense, he has created an image of Russia, of Ukraine, of what needs to happen that is quite different. And he surrounded himself with people who are only yes men. This is not a Politburo. This is not where there are 12 or 13 people who are all want to be the top.
This is the old leadership of the Soviet Union.
That's right. Remember in the old leadership, there would be differences and leaders would be deposed, as Khrushchev was after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And indeed, at the end, they started dying in rapid words. And Gorbachev coming to power was not inevitable. Putin is the only man in control. Everyone who is power owes him that power, as we saw again in this remarkable National Security Council meeting that was televised, in which he berated the Russian national intelligence chief in ways that you wouldn't talk to a kid or even a dog.
Yeah. I have a hypothetical question to pose to you with a map. The map isn't hypothetical. The map describes today's borders bordering the northwest of Russia. You can see Russia there on the right-hand side of the map, and bordering it are the three Baltic republics going north to south: Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which are independent, which are members of NATO. And south of Lithuania, along the Baltic Sea, south of Lithuania on the Baltic is Russia. It says that's what at one time was called East Prussia. And is famous for having been where Immanuel Kant taught all of his life. But it's Kaliningrad since the end of the Second World War. It's part of Russia, but it's discontiguous. And some people have imagined a potential next crisis in which Russia says, this all used to be part of our country, our Russian Empire. Now there's a foreign country stuck between our friends in Belarus, a NATO member stuck between our friends in Belarus and this part of Russia, this little bit on the coast. Can you imagine NATO saying, absolutely not? You can go by sea around to get there if you want. These are NATO countries. You have no rights to some overland passage or guaranteed route through NATO countries.
Yeah, so this is actually the scenario I've been most worried about since we got the first reports on what was going on with the Russian mobilization. I'm less concerned about Russia trying to get through Latvia and Lithuania direct to Russia. That's a pretty big step for them to take. What I'm more worried about is that really small corridor between Belarus and Kaliningrad that divides Poland and Lithuania, the border between Poland and Lithuania. This gap, which is only about 60 kilometers, is the logical, most direct way to get to Kaliningrad. And what we talked about earlier, the post-2020 uprising that really has made Belarus completely subservient to Russia, to the point that Russian troops today marched into Ukraine from Belarus with the full support of the Belarusian army. Those troops are going to stay. They're now there forever. And so you are, in fact, from a military perspective and not from a geopolitical perspective, erasing the difference between Belarus and Russia. Yeah. So now Russia actually is Belarus. And now it is 60 kilometers away along the border of Lithuania and Poland. And it could, if it creates a land bridge there, taking a bit of Polish and a bit of Lithuanian territory, it will have cut off the three Baltic states from a land bridge to the rest of NATO. That's and the question is are we, the United States, are we, NATO, going to defend every inch of that territory and risk nuclear war, because that's what we would be involved in, over denying the land bridge? My hope, my expectation to that is yes, but I put a significant amount of military forces in that gap right now, immediately, to make absolutely clear that Kaliningrad is Russian territory, but anything beyond Kaliningrad is the territory of Poland or the Lithuanian or Lithuania, and it cannot, must not be attacked.
Ivo, we have some questions from people who've been listening to you. Here's one from Stanley Fuhr, who asks, "What is the impact of Radio Free Europe in Ukraine and Russia, or is that or is that from the last century? Are we talking about? Well, they're also available online, I suppose. Do Western broadcasts have much impact on Russia? Do you know?
They're important, and they need to continue to be important. Of course, we've had a politicization of these remarkable institutions over the past few years, which kind of undermined the independence and of them. But you know, the BBC, which I would add to it, Voice of America, and the broadcasting capabilities, now video and audio over the internet, remain important sources of information. Importantly, in Russia, the internet's open. You want to read the New York Times, you can read the New York Times. This is not China. That may change, and some access is not that easy. But I've been participating in a Zoom webinar with Russian scholars throughout this crisis. And so there is openness to information in a way there wasn't, and that may turn out to be an Achilles heel for Russia. On the other hand, that same openness also means that they have very effectively used disinformation as a means to both mobilize their own population, as well as to undermine the credibility of more credible sources in Ukraine and indeed in our own country. They're busy right now on my Twitter feed, I can tell you.
Jerome Dances, a listener, asks, please compare the lead up to this war with the 1930s. Are they comparable?
I hope not. But I do think that there are. We should not think that this is just about Eastern Donbass, or just about Eastern Ukraine, or just about Ukraine. I do think that he is going to push as far as he can in order to upset the post-Cold War European security structure. And the only way to stop him is for us to be strong and united. Any division that we have in our country itself, and that we have between us and the Europeans, will play to his benefit. Now, that unity isn't automatic. It needs to be worked on every day. It requires intense diplomacy. I think the Biden administration in the last 4 months has sort of taught a masterclass on diplomacy 101 on how you do this. And they will need to continue to do it, not just this week, not just next month, but for years to come.
And a question from an anonymous attendee, it says here, which is, what is the status of the Jewish people in Ukraine? Are they in any particular? It seems that a very dangerous situation is there. What's the status of anti-Semitism?
I mean, anti-Semitism exists in the Ukrainian society, as it does indeed in all of our societies, unfortunately, and continues. That said, as I mentioned, the president and the prime minister of Ukraine are Jewish. This is not a country in which there is an official policy of anti-Semitism. There's a large Jewish population still in certain parts of Ukraine. There are Israeli citizens that also who live and work in Ukraine. Russia has used some pretty anti-Semitic, inflammatory language in the past in some of the disinformation efforts that they have. But I think in this case, Ukrainians are first Ukrainian and second only Ukrainian Orthodox or Jewish or whatever other religion they may have. I think this is going to unify the Ukrainian people because they now have a common enemy.
Just a clarification, listener Larissa Wayne took issue with your implying that Russia started World War II by invading Poland, which I think what you're saying is that the Hitler-Stalin Pact that was it 1939, I guess, or is it leads to the division, the partition of Poland by Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia,
Yes.
and the elimination of Poland. That's the event that you're describing. Not
Exactly. Yes.
So Germany was invading the eastern half, the western half of Poland, and the Soviet Union grabbed the other part of.
And the three Baltic states.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amy Schwartz writes, the sequence of events spotlighted in the first Trump impeachment, where Trump was withholding weapons that Ukraine argued that it needed to defend itself against Russia, takes on a much more significant context now. Did the U.S. end up providing full support to Ukraine despite Trump's machinations?
Yeah, in the end, we did, and in fact, even the weaponry that was withheld in order to blackmail the new president, Vladimir Zelensky, that weaponry was ultimately sent. So it didn't have in that sense, a direct impact on weakening Ukraine, other than it puts to a lie the idea that somehow, under the Trump administration, Putin never did anything like this, and only under the Biden and Obama administrations did he invade Ukraine. President Trump did more to divide NATO and to strengthen Russia's capacity and weaken Ukraine than any other president.
Sarah Breger asks, who are Putin's supporters in Russia? And I would add to that, and how numerous are they?
So the supporters, his popularity is before this event. Of course, we have no good opinion polling generally, but certainly not in more recent days. Is down in sort of the mid 60s, which is probably pretty accurate, and it tends to be the older generation that watches TV, and particularly outside of the major cities of Moscow and St. Petersburg. Support for this war, we're going to have to watch very carefully. Most Russians don't think that this is something that we should be doing. All the reporting out of Moscow suggested that no one thought this was going to happen. Yeah. Just as many in Ukraine didn't think it was going to happen. It was too inconceivable that what are in fact brethren, Slavic peoples, shared histories, would be going to war against each other. I think one thing to bear watching is what is the impact on the Russian population. I think rallying around a flag is likely in the beginning, because it just generally tends to be that happens. But I don't think it's going to last for very long, and it probably won't last very long at all for a younger, more sophisticated international population, which, by the way, for the last 30 years has vacationed and gotten used to travel anywhere at any time. That's going to be more difficult.
It's a question about China, and I would actually put it to you this way. We keep on talking about how Russia has created a unified NATO alliance. Has the U.S. With NATO created a unified Sino-Russian alliance? That is, have we pushed them closer together?
I don't know whether we are the ones who are pushing them closer together, or they're just the affinity between the two powers and the interest in competing with and even undermining the United States has led them to come closer together. And clearly, the relationship between China and Russia is closer today than it's been in a long time. The personal relationship between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin is stronger. We just saw that in the first time that Xi Jinping met with a foreign leader since COVID was on February 4th at the opening of the Olympics, and it was with Vladimir Putin, where they issued this remarkably long 5,300 word statement on that there was no limits to their cooperation. Interestingly enough, however, while China has not condemned Russia, it has also made very clear that it believes in the independence and territorial integrity of all states. And in that very statement didn't sign on to Russian views about Ukraine. And it would be very interesting to see how they worm themselves out of this problem, because China, of course, for the last 60, 70, 80 years is the leading advocate for countries to recognize the independence and sovereignty of their countries. Their argument about Hong Kong and, frankly, Taiwan, which they believe is part of China.
Yes, yes.
And opposing the external interference in the internal affairs of states. This is what Ukraine is all about. It's about denying the independence and territorial integrity of Ukraine, and of course the direct interference in the internal affairs of the states. So Russian statesmen out of Beijing have kind of waffled on this. and it will be interesting to watch how far that goes. Opening seems to me for us to engage the Chinese and to see if we can, break some differences between the two.
A quick question from Jennifer Malvin. As a citizen, how would I notice a difference in my life, whether living in Russia or living in Ukraine?
You will have far more freedoms in Ukraine than you do in Russia. Ukraine is an imperfect democracy. There is plenty of corruption still going on, but you have free and fair elections. The last election in 2019 had two pro-Western folks vying for the presidency. The entire parliament changed in terms of who got elected, much younger, much more professional. And in Russia, you have none of that. There is severe curtailment on freedom of speech and on independent media, on your capacity for independent action and independent collaboration. So it's just a much freer country. In terms of economic standing, the differences aren't terrible, particularly between the countrysides or indeed between the big cities. But there is a far bigger Western influence and presence in Ukraine than there is in Russia.
Ivo, I think we've come to the end of our time. I want to ask Suzanne Borden if I'm keeping time accurately, and to thank you for so much of your time today on this sadly historic moment when it would seem a rather large war has erupted in Europe with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Suzanne?
Yes, thank you, Ambassador Daalder. Thank you, Robert. This was phenomenal. We really appreciate you helping us and our audience understand what is going on today. I'm sorry we could not get to more questions. There are just so many, but I guess we will all have to look out for you on the various networks in the coming days. And again, thank you, everybody, for joining us. You can go to momentmag.com, where there'll be articles on various topics that you can read. Again, thank you, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Ivo.
Thank you.